Hi guys, welcome back or welcome to Switch to Life. And in today's video, we are going to be reviewing Blue Sky Studios' second movie, Robots. And the reason we're talking about it is because it just celebrated its 20th anniversary. Now, if you want my opinion on the movie, it's actually a bit of a letdown because, I don't know, it just has a very simple concept. A movie about robots in a world of robots. And the plot is actually really good and kind of inspiring, but at the same time, it's extremely predictable. Now, I know that this movie is actually pretty good and beloved by a lot of people, but that's just my opinion, and, well, this is my review, so I'm gonna be honest. This movie is also held back by being the second movie of Blue Sky Studios' lineup, and because of that, held back by the early days of CG animation. Sometimes the characters just straight up look weird, and I guess that's kind of the point, because they're supposed to be made up of a bunch of parts, like robots. And the lip sync isn't that great. I mean, I can tell they definitely tried, because here the metal is bending, which, if you ask me, is not something that should be happening. But the metal is bending to form words with their mouths. But unfortunately, I just don't really like it, because sometimes what they say just doesn't add up with what's coming out of their lips. That being said, while I don't like the animation, I do love the world building. And honestly, I think the best part of the movie is the very first 5 minutes, during which we see Rodney Copperbottom get born, or rather be made. As for the voice acting, I would actually say the voice acting is really good, especially when it comes to Fender. He did an amazing job being this weird, wacky character while still portraying an actual character, which is really good. And aside from Fender, a lot of the other characters have really cool voices. He just happens to be the one who stands out. As for the music, well, I got a love-hate relationship with the music. Honestly, the soundtrack for this movie is actually really good. I really loved the wacky robotic vibe you get from the music, and it's just really cool. My problem comes in the fact that this movie kind of relies on pop music, which, yeah, I kind of get it. Shrek just barely came out, and that definitely relied on pop music. And, well, I don't really know what to say. It's just, I really love Shrek, but I don't like the pop music in this movie, and I just don't know why. I mean, they did everything right by having the characters move with the beat of the background music, which is really good, but unfortunately, I just don't think the music was good in this movie. At least the pop music. The soundtrack is, again, really good. As for the story, well, like I said, it's pretty predictable, but also a really good story, especially if you just want a simple movie about robots, which is what this is. So we're introduced to Rodney Copperbottom when he is being made by his parents, and yeah, that's a really fun and interesting concept.
He's got your mom's eyes and my dad's nose. I knew we were smart to save those parts.
But I think the best part is that when he's crying, you can just adjust the volume. That's gotta be a lifesaver. But unfortunately, he does come from a pretty poor family. His dad is a dishwasher at a restaurant. So as time passes and Rodney needs to grow up, they need to allow him to get some brand new big boy parts. But every time he gets new parts, it's a hand-me-down from one of his family members. At one point, he even got a dress from his cousin Veronica. That said, Rodney actually had a really good life, especially because his dad taught him about Big Weld, this robot who made it a priority to never lock out anyone. No matter what you're made of, a good idea can come from anywhere. This inspires Rodney to try to be an inventor with his life, and after hearing a mantra of see a need, fill a need, he gets an idea to build a brand new invention. Unfortunately, there are a few hiccups along the way, but that doesn't stop him. And eventually, as an adult, he makes Wonderbot, a mini robot who is going to help his dad with the dishes at the restaurant. And, well, unfortunately, it causes a bit of problems whenever it gets nervous, but it actually works really good. So Rodney thinks he's ready to go to the big city and show off his invention to Big Weld himself. And I really love the the emotional goodbye at the train station, especially because his dad says that his dream was to be a musician, but instead he became a dishwasher like his own father before him. So he decides to let Rodney chase after his own dream. And so Rodney goes off to the big city. And at this point, the movie is kind of done with the good parts. Obviously, there's a bit of humor involved as we continue forward, but in my opinion, the story continues and there's not really a lot of emotion, which is kind of sad. But then there's also a bunch of random action or funny sequences, like characters sliding on marbles, being trapped in a marble cage and flung across the city, and that high-speed magnet car chase at the end of the movie, which I actually did enjoy that one because it felt like the kind of thing that would be in a movie about robots. Anyway, the story progresses with Rodney meeting Fender, who is this broken down bot who's been outmoded. We'll talk more about that later. But then he goes to Big Weld Incorporated, at which point the gates are shut and he can't get in. So he tries to sneak his way in with his Wonderbot, and when he does, he discovers that Big Weld had retired and the company now has a new CEO in Ratchet. And the thing is, Big Weld used to care about a lot of robots. Pretty much if you were old or new, or whether you were poor or rich, it didn't matter. He held you in a high regard. With Ratchet, he only cares about making money, and at the same time, he's also forming a sinister plot with his mom to get rid of all the junk robots, which he has no care or regard for just because they're rusty and outdated and they need to be replaced or upgraded. And if they can't afford an upgrade, they will be melted down for scrap. And he starts by doing a really bad thing, making it so that the company no longer produces new parts. So now robots can't get replacement parts. It's either upgrade or be left in the gutter so sweepers can come pick you up. Then Rodney is magnetized out of the building, and then a bunch of stuff chases after him because, you know, the entire world is made of metal. And, well, eventually he ends up knocked out in the middle of a dumpster barrel, and then Fender comes and steals his foot, and then he chases Fender across the city, and then he meets Fender and all of his friends, which I'm just gonna say that aside from Fender and Rodney, who has main character energy, everybody else in this movie is kind of forgettable when it comes to that friend group. They got some really cool designs, but they don't have any character to them whatsoever. They're just there to make a roster, which is not that great. So Fender ended up breaking his neck joint and he needs to go to the shop to get a new part, but they don't have neck joints in stock. So Rodney, out of the good of his heart, decides to buy a couple of random pieces and then create a new neck joint from scratch, at which point Fender can now attach his head to his body. So the gang decides to invite Rodney to live with them in their Aunt Fanny's house. Not their actual aunt, just a kind old lady who takes strays off of the streets.
Why is she called Aunt Fanny?
Couldn't call her Aunt Booty.
Whoa! I'm Rodney Big Bottom. No, I'm Rodney Copper Bottom.
Meanwhile, Ratchet and his mom, Madame Gasket, put their plan into action and stop making parts. So when parts run out in shops and nobody can afford to upgrade, so they decide to start killing each other in an effort to claim spare parts. And an angry mob is formed, but then they hear about Rodney who fixed Fender's neck. And so they decide to ask him for help, and Rodney does his best to help as many bots as possible, but there's just too many of them. So Rodney decides that they need to find Big Weld and ask him to come back to take over the Big Weld company. Unfortunately, they have a problem because they don't know where to find him. Luckily, he always attends the Big Weld ball, so they go to the ball by sneaking their way in, at which point Big Weld isn't there. So Rodney reveals himself to be the guy who's fixing up the mistakes of Ratchet, and so Ratchet decides, I need to kill this kid because if he keeps fixing robots, then my mom can't get her scrap metal. Luckily, right when Rodney is captured, another employee of Big Weld, Cappy, decides to help out. She says that Rodney needs to leave town so that he doesn't get himself killed, but he refuses to leave and decides to ask her if she knows where Big Weld is. So they go to Big Weld's house, at which point, after a pretty long but also fun domino experience, they find out that Big Weld decided to retire because by caring about robots, it was like he was having a charity event. But that just made it so the company went nearly bankrupt. So now Ratchet, who is motivated by money, has taken over. At this point, though, most of the Big Well employees think that Ratchet is actually a really bad boss because he's abusive and he has no care for his customers. You know, because he's secretly trying to kill them. So everybody thinks that Big Weld needs to come back to take over the company. But unfortunately, Big Weld is just so depressed and down on his luck that he just spends his days making domino chains. So he tells Rodney that he should just give up and that he needs to leave town. So Rodney decides to say, you know, I always wanted to grow up to be like him. Never meet your heroes, I guess. So then he goes to the train station, and while all this is happening, Fender, who also snuck his way into the ball, ended up meeting this beautiful girl. Unfortunately, when he took her home, he was singing in the oil and got distracted, at which point a sweeper picked him up because he's been outmoded. So Fender finds himself in the scrap factory and he overhears the plan between Ratchet and Madame Gasket, realizes they're planning to kill everyone who can't afford to upgrade, and learning this information actually costs him his legs as, well, he breaks down and now he can't find them. So he grabs a random pair of legs, which happen to belong to a girl. Does that mean that Fender is now trans? I don't know. I'm pretty sure that wasn't the intention of the creators at the time, but hey, here we are. So Fender sneaks out, and while everybody is saying goodbye to Rodney at the train station, he reveals their master plan, and that inspires Rodney to stand up and take a fight to save everyone in Robot City. And luckily, that's also when Big Weld shows up, and he says, just like how Rodney wanted to grow up to be Big Weld, now Big Weld wants to grow up to have a heart just like Rodney's. And so they all work together to go to Big Weld Industries, at which point they confront Ratchet, but Ratchet decides to attack Big Weld and then make it so that he no longer works properly. This way he can easily be transported to the scrap factory and melted down and killed. Luckily, Rodney shows up and rescues Big Weld, but then during a high-speed chase, he also has to fix Big Weld's brain so it actually functions. And during that chase, they end up working their way over to the scrap factory, and so they prepared for a final battle between Ratchet, Madame Gasket, and their army of hundreds of scrap bots. And luckily, that's when Piper shows up, Piper being Fender's sister, and she was just left behind because she was a girl. Yeah, I hate it when movies do that. Luckily, she came up with a plan to blab about Ratchet's plan to everyone in town, and so they band together and create an army capable of taking down the army of scrap bots. So the entire town is duking it out, and eventually the scrap bots are defeated, Madame Gasket is thrown into a furnace and melted down, and Ratchet ends up losing all of his upgrades, turning him into a out mode. Then the movie ends with Rodney going to his hometown and saying hello to his dad and mom. And I forgot to mention that earlier in the movie, he got a letter that his dad has actually broken down and now he needs a new part, but he can't get it. Luckily, at the end of the movie, Big Weld shows up with enough new parts to make sure that he never needs a new part again. So now Big Weld has taken over as CEO of Big Weld Industries and has decided to name Rodney as his future successor, which is actually a really great ending. And to celebrate, Rodney gives his dad a trumpet and he plays a fusion of jazz and funk called junk music, and they end up throwing a party. And that's how the movie ends. So, as I was saying earlier, the movie is pretty creative with its world design and the design of its characters. Unfortunately, when it comes to the characters, they're kind of forgettable. When it comes to the story, it's pretty bland and unoriginal. And as for the animation, it's held back by the early days of CG, which is kinda sad. Now, believe it or not, this movie was actually supposed to get a sequel, but unfortunately, Blue Sky decided to focus instead on the Ice Age franchise, and they just couldn't afford to make a Robots 2. So, yeah. And now with Blue Sky Studios shut down, we are never going to get a sequel to this. Then again, I thought the same thing with Ice Age, and now Disney is the one who's making Ice Age 6. But anyway, that's it for my review. Make sure to leave your thoughts of this movie down below in the comments section, and also feel free to join my membership program by clicking the join button down below and support the channel, or you can just do the free option and subscribe. Speaking of, we are really close to 1,000 subscribers. Let's see if we can hit that milestone by the end of the month. But with that in mind, I hope you're all staying safe out there, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye-bye.
We've come to rescue our friend, you evil bag of bolts, and you will be defeated by the very outmosts that you scorn and detest.